When I first started driving for John Rempel in 1951, it was known as John Rempel Transport. John worked out of an office in his house in Edmonton. In 1956, the company bought out Archie Trail in Dawson Creek and became known as Rempel Trail Transportation Limited. This was the office and shop from about 1962 to 1975, located in Edmonton, Alberta. I started hauling on the Alaska Highway in 1952, and at this time there was an actual milepost every mile from Dawson Creek, mile 0, to Fairbanks, Alaska, mile 1523. The equipment we drove was an R195 International with a 406 gas engine and a 2-speed axle, 5-speed transmission. We hauled about 3,500 gallons of fuel on this rig. This is Gordy with his R195 International on top of Trutch Mountain, mile 195. Fueling up in Dawson Creek, mile 0 on the Alaska Highway. In 1953, John asked us to move to Dawson Creek and haul up the Alaska Highway. We lived in this duplex, and Alf and Jean Rempel lived in the other side. That's Muriel and Brian standing on the front step. Living in Dawson Creek, we loaded from these tanks rather than hauling from Edmonton. Delivering a load to the Fort Nelson Airport, mile 300. That's Pete McAvoy checking the load. We also delivered fuel to the airport at Smith River, which was 25 miles north off of the Alaska Highway at mile 517. We often had to chain up on Steamboat Mountain, mile 352, on what we called the mine hill. If it was cold, and it usually was, traction was good. This is the summit of Steamboat Mountain. When we drove to Alaska in 2001, they were rebuilding the road over Steamboat to reduce the steep grade and switchbacks, so this picture is one of a kind. In May 1960, we moved to Kamloops, and this was our terminal with the office on the left end of the shop. The Atco trailer on the right became our office and driver's room, complete with indoor plumbing and air conditioning, which was needed in Kamloops. This office was a huge improvement over the 8x30 office that we had after we moved out of the old shop. The equipment improved considerably from the 50s in Dawson Creek. We were operating Kenworth and Freightliners, semi-trailers, 5-axle, but mostly truck and pup configuration. I put a lot of miles on number 20, a Kenworth sleeper cab, truck and pup, with a 250 Cummins and a 4-4 transmission. That's 4 in the main and 4 in the auxiliary, with 3 progressive and a 90 under. Cy Karanko was my partner. We hauled all over BC, and this rig is on Highway 6 east of Vernon over the Monashee Pass, headed for Nakusp. In winter, we'd leave the pup at the bulk plant in Vernon, because the mine hill was so steep you couldn't make it if you had to chain up. That's my brother-in-law, Ben Francisco. They got huge amounts of snow over the Monashee. We had to cross the Arrow Lakes at Needles, and as you can see, the ferry ran all year round. It's mighty pretty when the sun's shining. I had some interesting experiences coming off the ferry after fresh snow. The story's in my Popsi book. This forestry lookout didn't have to worry too much about fires in the wintertime. Too much snow. We hauled to a number of construction and mine sites. This is Emil Anderson's camp at Avola, rebuilding the Yellowhead Highway 5 north of Kamloops. Construction of the new bridge over the North Thompson River barrier. You have to realize Phil Gillardy was a BC Highways Minister and was building some decent roads in BC. Thanks, Phil, the only mistake you made was not four-laning them all. This is what most of the old bridges looked like. My two boys, Brian and Rod, are on the bridge on Highway 1 near Malacqua. I guess these bridges did the job in the 50s and 60s. They probably wouldn't carry the loads being hauled today. This is probably between Avola and Blue River. Remember when we had to travel on the west side of the river through Cottonwood Flats to a one-way road on the side of the mountain? There was a traffic light the last few years before construction, as it was a one-way road. We couldn't pull a pup through there. The completed Yellowhead Highway 5 north of Little Fort. This is between Quesnel and Barkerville on the way to Caribou Gold Quartz mine at Wells. When we hauled to the mine in the 60s, it was basically a logging road, so you had to get out of the way of the logging trucks. There were some pretty good poles in there. This is coming up to Robber's Roost. Climbing up to Devil's Canyon was the steepest. Looks like 2 sets of 3-railers should do the trick. The last few years I finally got smart and would pump fuel from the pup onto the body tank, put on 1 set of chains, and never spin a wheel. We get too soon old and too late smart. This was our shop in Dawson Creek, and it gets pretty mucky in the spring when the frost is coming out of the ground. Mile 186 on the Alaska Highway. At 187, we'd kick her out of gear and be doing about 90 miles an hour. We'd go almost to the top of mile 189, that hill in the distance on the right, before you could put it into gear at 60 miles an hour. We're talking miles, not kilometers. One spring in the 60s, the Bulkley River was flooding near Telkwa on Highway 16 west of Prince George. A few of the homes had water in the basement big time. There was concern that some of the bridges would wash out. The railroad decided to park some rail cars on the bridge to keep it from going downstream. You'd want to stay in the middle of the road along here. I put a few miles on number 49. This is on the Hope-Princeton Highway. We couldn't go down the Fraser Canyon until the canyon was rebuilt. When we were hauling avgas to Prince George, we'd take loads to Merritt from Kamloops over the Hope-Princeton to Ioko Refinery, then back to Kamloops. Then we'd switch drivers for the trip to Prince George Airport. This is the old Alexandra Bridge between Boston Bar and Spuzzum. Those are our kids, Barb in the foreground, Rod at the back, and Brian in the right foreground. There's the new Alexandra Bridge in the distance. That's Barb, our youngest, climbing around on the cairn at the new Alexandra Bridge. One of the many tunnels through the Fraser Canyon. And then there's Jackass Mountain. Looking over the Fraser River and the railroads on either side, CP and CN. In the mid-60s, a mountain slide took out the highway through the canyon. A Bailey Bridge was installed in a few days and traffic resumed. This was our driver crew in 1963. Back row left to right, Vern Medill, Irv Toes, Gene Johnson, Albert Wessel, Lance Saver, and Tim Pollock. Front row left to right, Jim Gallagher, Assistant General Manager in Edmonton, Gordon Thiessen, Cy Karanko, Fred Haggard, Jim Lang, the Kamloops manager. The three in front center have just received their gold watches, a 3-year Safe Driving Award. Fred Haggard, Gordon Thiessen, Cy Karanko posing with their gold watch Safe Driving Award. In 1964, I became the terminal manager in Kamloops, so during the slow time in spring, I painted this design on the back of this pup. That's Lance Saver up there beside the truck. In 1971, we went to different company colors, from red tractors to green, yellow, and white. Inside the cab, notice the short gear stick in this Freightliner. And of course the capacity increased as we went to 7-axle A trains to 7-axle B trains. And of course bottom loading was a good thing. You'd never get caught with your foot on the valve visiting with the driver and overfilling the tank. At least once a year we had branch managers meetings in Edmonton where our head office was. From left to right is Jim Gallagher, Assistant General Manager, Gordy Thiessen from Kamloops, Jerry Hay, Dawson Creek, Bill Rempel, Burnaby, Dave Wilson was in sales, and Alf Rempel was manager in Calgary. The same bunch of managers, except that Dan Schmick is second from the left. He was manager in Edmonton. 3 more Safe Driving Award winners. Len Roberts, left, John DeHaan, and Ted Hansen. This was about 1971. John Locke and Ron McMillan received a plaque from National Safety Council for driving 1 million miles accident-free. This was the driver crew in 1971. Back row left to right, Earl Cahill, George Gatehouse, Ron McMillan, Doug McIntosh, Ed Knodel, John Locke. In the front, left to right, Gordy Thiessen, Kamloops manager, John DeHaan, Len Roberts, Ted Hansen, Jack Mackay, he was the president of Rempel Trail.